Beijing asserted itself as Abuja's comprehensive strategic partner and warned against any foreign interference in Nigeria under the guise of human rights or religion.
As Nigeria's comprehensive strategic partner, China firmly supports the Nigerian government in leading its people on the development path suited to its national conditions. China firmly opposes any country using religion and human rights as an excuse to interfere in other countries' internal affairs and threatening other countries with sanctions and force.
China's support for Nigeria is more than diplomatic solidarity. It has economic aspects to it, as Nigeria is a key partner in China's Key Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. A report suggests Nigeria is one of the top African destinations for direct Chinese foreign investment in sectors like oil, natural gas, and solid minerals, including lithium and gold.
Something unusual just unfolded behind closed doors, and Washington did not anticipate it. After a direct external warning aimed at Nigeria, expectations were clear: pressure, consequences, isolation. Instead, China stepped in, quietly, deliberately, with capital, leverage, and a strategic understanding that could rebalance power across West Africa. Now Western capitals are recalculating. The United States is responding, and Nigeria, along navigating between competing global forces, may have just altered the rules of the game. So what exactly did China offer Nigeria? Why did this move trigger alarm across Washington and Europe? And could this be the moment Africa stops reacting and starts deciding? Stay with us. This story runs deeper than it appears. For months, pressure on Nigeria had been quietly intensifying. It didn't arrive with troops or ultimatums. It came through carefully worded statements, strategic warnings, coordinated media narratives, and finally, a high-level external warning tied to powerful political interests, one that sent ripples through diplomatic circles. In Abuja, the message was unmistakable. Nigeria's growing autonomy, its expanding relationships beyond the Western orbit, and its refusal to fully align with external strategic expectations were becoming a concern, a serious one. Behind closed doors, discussions grew tense. Trade access, security partnerships, financial exposure, all were suddenly under review. For Nigeria, the timing could not have been more delicate. The country was already managing currency volatility, internal security pressures, and the complex task of restoring public confidence in governance. Any additional external pressure, especially from a major global power, risked cascading effects across markets, institutions, and public sentiment. And then something unexpected happened. Nigeria did not respond publicly, no aggressive statements, no diplomatic retaliation, no visible pushback, just silence. In Western capitals, that silence was widely interpreted as uncertainty or vulnerability. But in Beijing, it was interpreted very differently, because while analysts debated possibilities, China was already acting, not through headlines, not through public announcements, but through envoys, frameworks, and quiet assurances. Multiple regional observers report that Chinese officials initiated discreet, high-level engagements with Nigerian counterparts, meetings that avoided publicity but carried substantial strategic weight. At the heart of these conversations was a clear message: Nigeria would not be left exposed. China's interest in Nigeria is long-standing. Africa's largest economy, a vast consumer base, key maritime access points, energy potential, and a geographic position that anchors West and Central Africa. But this moment was not business as usual. This was not about routine financing or standard development cooperation. This was about strategic positioning. China signaled its readiness to support Nigeria economically and politically at a moment when Western pressure was reaching a peak, not as an act of goodwill but as a calculated move grounded in long-term interests. That calculation reflects a broader global shift. The international system is no longer dominated by a single center of power. While the United States retains immense influence, its ability to unilaterally shape outcomes, particularly across Africa, is no longer guaranteed. Nations that once faced limited choices are now exploring alternatives. Nigeria appears to have tested that reality. Sources familiar with the discussions indicate that China provided reassurances across three critical fronts. First, economic continuity. In the event of financial or trade-related pressure, China signaled its capacity to help stabilize key Nigerian sectors through expanded market access, financial coordination, and accelerated investment channels. Second, infrastructure momentum. Projects previously moving at a measured pace were quietly advanced: transport links, energy systems, industrial zones. Progress occurred without fanfare but with clear intent. Third, diplomatic support. Perhaps the most consequential element, China conveyed that Nigeria would not stand isolated in international forums should tensions escalate. This aspect, according to multiple accounts, triggered concern in Western policy circles. Because once diplomatic backing enters the equation, the cost of coercive pressure increases significantly, and that's when the narrative shifted. Western coverage adjusted its tone. Official statements moved from warnings to responses, and strategic discussions began focusing less on how to apply pressure and more on how far China was prepared to extend its support. From the U.S. perspective, this development was no longer solely about Nigeria. It was about precedent. If Africa's largest economy could absorb external pressure by leveraging alternative partnerships, what signal would that send to other nations? Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, South Africa. The concern was not immediate confrontation, it was momentum. And so countermeasures began not through force, but through strategy. Policy reviews were initiated, diplomatic engagement intensified, and subtle recalibrations emerged in trade and security discussions. This evolving response is what many observers now describe as a strategic pushback. Yet one crucial detail remains widely overlooked: Nigeria did not align itself with any single power. Nigeria expanded its options by engaging China at a moment of heightened external pressure. Abuja communicated a message not of defiance, but of strategic independence, and that message is resonating well beyond Nigeria's borders. If this approach endures, it may signal a turning point not just for Nigeria, but for how African nations navigate influence, leverage, and sovereignty in an increasingly divided global landscape. The shift did not happen overnight, but it happened fast enough to unsettle policymakers across multiple capitals. Within days of China's quiet engagement with Nigeria, signals began to emerge that the balance had changed, not through dramatic announcements or public ultimatums, but through subtle recalibrations that only seasoned observers recognized. Meetings were rescheduled. Language in official briefings softened, then sharpened again, and policy documents that once framed Nigeria as a pressure point were suddenly rewritten as strategic assessments. The response had begun. For the United States, this moment required caution. Direct confrontation would only deepen Nigeria's pivot toward alternative partners. Silence, on the other hand, risked signaling weakness. The solution was a familiar one: strategic countermoves designed to reassert influence without forcing open conflict. The first signs appeared in economic discussions. Trade frameworks that had long favored Western access were quietly reviewed. Compliance standards were emphasized. Financing conditions tightened. Nothing dramatic. Enough to dominate headlines, but enough to be felt by markets and ministries alike. This was not punishment, it was signaling. At the same time, diplomatic engagement increased. Senior envoys reappeared in Abuja. Conversations once delayed were suddenly prioritized. The tone was respectful, but firm, underscoring that Nigeria remained important but not untouchable. Yet something had changed. Nigeria was no longer negotiating from a position of uncertainty. With China now visibly engaged behind the scenes, Abuja possessed leverage it had not openly exercised before. Conversations that once felt one-sided became balanced. Requests were met with counter-requests. Timelines slowed. Conditions were questioned. This subtle shift unsettled long-standing assumptions. For decades, external pressure on African economies followed a predictable pattern: warning, isolation, adjustment, compliance. This time, the pattern broke, and other countries noticed. Across West and East Africa, policymakers watched closely not just the actions, but the reactions. They observed how pressure was applied, how alternatives emerged, and how Nigeria maneuvered without escalation. What they saw was possibility, not alignment, not rebellion, but leverage. And that possibility carried consequences far beyond Nigeria. In Western policy circles, concern began to spread not as panic, but as strategic anxiety. Analysts raised difficult questions. If Nigeria could balance competing powers without immediate fallout, what prevented others from doing the same? The issue was not China itself, it was choice. The emergence of viable alternatives diluted the effectiveness of traditional tools: sanctions, access restrictions, diplomatic isolation. Tools that relied on exclusivity now faced competition. This realization triggered a second phase of response. Narratives shifted. Media coverage increasingly framed Nigeria as a battleground rather than a partner. Commentaries emphasized risk, dependency, and long-term consequences of alternative alliances. The goal was not to accuse but to caution. Yet even this approach faced resistance. Within Africa, the framing rang familiar and increasingly outdated. Many viewed it as another attempt to discourage diversification rather than address underlying concerns about equity, respect, and mutual benefit. Meanwhile, China remained notably restrained. There were no victory laps, no declarations of dominance, no public challenges. Instead, progress continued quietly. Infrastructure timelines advanced, financial discussions deepened, trade channels expanded. Each move reinforced the same message: engagement without spectacle. This restraint proved strategic. By avoiding public confrontation, China reduced the pressure on Nigeria to choose sides. It allowed Abuja to frame its actions as pragmatic rather than ideological, a crucial distinction in a polarized world. As weeks passed, the ripple effects widened. International institutions began reassessing regional projections. Risk models adjusted. Investment analysts revised assumptions about influence and access in West Africa. Nigeria was no longer viewed as a passive recipient of global pressure but as an active negotiator, and that recalibration unsettled more than just policymakers. Markets reacted. Currency movements reflected uncertainty but also opportunity. Investors who once waited for Western cues began tracking alternative signals. Infrastructure-linked sectors attracted renewed interest. Energy and logistics projects gained attention as strategic assets rather than domestic initiatives. Nigeria's position in global conversations had shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. This evolution forced the United States into a delicate balancing act. Escalation risked accelerating the very outcome it sought to prevent. Accommodation risked signaling decline. The path forward required precision engagement without endorsement, pressure without provocation. Thus, a new phase emerged: competitive coexistence. Rather than excluding Nigeria from systems of influence, efforts focused on remaining relevant within them. Cooperation continued but with clearer expectations. Assistance flowed but with tighter framing. Dialogue persisted but underlined by competition. In effect, Nigeria had become a shared priority rather than a controlled one, and this reality introduced a new variable into global strategy. For Africa, the implications were profound. Nigeria's experience demonstrated that strategic patience could yield leverage, that silence could be read as strength, that alternatives, when credible, could transform negotiation dynamics. This did not mean abandoning long-standing partnerships, it meant redefining them. Across the continent, officials began quietly asking the same question: how many options do we really have? And for the first time in decades, the answer was no longer obvious, but it was no longer singular either. This is where the story deepens, because what began as a response to pressure is now evolving into a broader test of influence, agency, and strategic autonomy. In Act 3, we'll examine what comes next, whether this balancing act holds, where the risks lie, and whether Africa's expanding options lead to empowerment or a new kind of vulnerability.